Good evening, everyone. It's nice to see everyone here. My name is Marie Giorgetti, and I'm the president of the Framingham Garden Club. I first would like to thank the Framingham Public Library for our collaboration, and specifically Don Delasanto, Sarah Listrom, and Tara Hall. It's always a pleasure to work with you. Key members of the Framingham Garden Club I'd like to thank are Shannon Fitzpatrick, our first vice president, who has made the connection to Dr. Gegear and has been in touch with him for the presentation, and to Marilyn Hanley, our co-chair of the Publicity Committee, who has worked with the Framingham Public Library to really try to get the word out in many different areas. And I'd like to also thank Access Framingham and Marilyn, because Marilyn is coordinating Access Framingham for this production to be recorded. Lastly, I'd like to thank the Framingham 325th Anniversary Committee for accepting this presentation as part of the anniversary event. And I need to read a land acknowledgement right now. As we celebrate 325 years of history, diversity, and vibrancy in Framingham, we take a moment to acknowledge the deeper roots of this region. First, we recognize that the city of Framingham is part of the ancestral homelands of the Nipmuc, the freshwater people. We acknowledge the historical legacy of colonialism and racism by honoring and respecting the land. We likewise acknowledge and honor the traditions of all people indigenous to what is currently known as the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, including the Nipmuc, Pennacook, Pocumtuck, Mohican, Massachusetts, Nauset, and Wampanoag peoples. This event is part of the year-long celebration for Framingham, and together we honor the past, celebrate today, and look forward to the future as one community. So from a horticultural perspective, there's lots of research that can guide our gardening practices. And so for a few years, I've been using Dr. Gegear's research to guide mine, and through the Open Space Preservation Commission in Southborough, and with Freddie Gillespie's generosity of donating seeds to community members, we've been using Dr. Gegear's plant list through his research to develop native seeds in our gardens. And recently, last year at our Earth Day celebration, we actually focused part of our booth on the pollinator component and the importance of native plants. This past winter, with the generosity from Freddie's group in Southborough, we winter sowed over 100 jugs in preparation for hopefully having these plants germinate to put in our gardens, and also hopefully maybe next year to sell them at our plant sale. We have throughout the room a QR code that will, if you take a photo of it, it will link you directly to Dr. Gegear's website and his plant list. So the Framingham Garden Club just welcomes you all, and we hope that you benefit and your gardening strategies maybe get modified a bit by this presentation. So at this time, I'd like to introduce Shannon Fitzpatrick. Shannon is our first vice president, and she will introduce Dr. Gegear.
Hello. So who here has heard of the Gegear list? Raise your hand. Well, tonight I am so pleased to introduce the actual Gegear. Dr. Robert Gegear is an associate professor in the Department of Biology at UMass Dartmouth. He received his PhD from Western University in Canada. He's actually Canadian, and was a and was a postdoctoral fellow at the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. I figured out that what's it called? Acronym for that is DEEB at the University of Toronto in Canada, and in the Department of Neurobiology at UMass Medical School. Yes, bees have neurons. Dr. Gegear's research focuses on ecology, evolution, and conservation of plant pollination systems, with particular emphasis on relationships between pollinator behavior and floral diversity. So without further ado, I present to you Dr. Robert Gegear.
All right. I'll try to speak loudly. Hopefully this can pick me up. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. I am, even though I work at UMass Dartmouth, so I have a heck of a commute. I live in Framingham, and so I've given about, I don't know, probably between 100 and 200 of these talks, and this is my second in Framingham. It was supposed to be 3 at McAuliffe, but there was a scheduling problem from my end, so I feel badly about that. But it was nice to have a 5-minute commute to get here, rather than driving down to the Cape. But anyway, so today, I am giving this talk. So this is the first talk I've given in 2025 to the public. So I start giving my talks around now because people start to think about what they want to put in their gardens and what cleanup they may or may not want to do after I give my talk. So, you know, when we put plants in the ground, as gardeners, you know, everybody has different goals, right? So today, if your goal is to increase native biodiversity in your own backyard, you're concerned about conservation and our native plants and animals, then I'm going to give you ways to do that and talk about the problem, what the problem is, what is a pollinator. It's surprisingly few people know what a pollinator actually is or why it's important. So we'll talk a bit about that. And so that's your goal. Now, that said, if you're not doing that and you have different goals, you like ornamentals from Europe, I'm not here to make you feel bad, right? So if that's your decision, fine, we could talk about that. But what really bothers me is when people think that they're helping pollinators and they're actually hurting. That's where we need some education and we need to correct things a bit. And that's what my job is, or one of the things that I hope to accomplish tonight. So this talk, so there'll be a bit of rust probably because it's my first talk of 2025. Hopefully I can get back in things quickly. But I was thrown a bit of a curveball because with the 325th anniversary of Framingham's founding, I was told to try to bring Framingham's history into my talk. So, and I wasn't a history major, nor did I play one on TV. So we're going to give it a go. So as was mentioned, so let's go back in time to the 1600s and what Framingham looked like in the 1600s. So most of the information I got was from webs and books that probably are about 70% accurate. I don't know. Not going into any politics, but we just want to know what's the lay of the land. What would we expect here plant-wise? So the one thing that we would expect is everything that's here is native because the non-native part of it had not entered the system yet. And what people wrote about Framingham and the biological characteristics of Framingham was that there was a lot of open space. There was a lot of meadows, grassland, right? There was some forest. Obviously, the Nipmuc were in the area, and they farmed some plants, but also they would regularly burn to get the grass. When the Europeans came into the area, they said that it was the highest quality grass that they'd ever seen, and that's because the Nipmuc people were managing the land, okay? So they did have some crops, some of which would have been pollinated, but also they used a lot of the native plants, so native flowering plants, which we're going to focus on today, for medicinal purposes. So this is just a list of what they'd use for various things. And a lot of these I'm going to talk about today. So they would go through and presumably identify populations of these native plants in the area and collect from them, but not overexploit, because if you overexploit, there are none left for you to use. So there must have been some sort of sustainability, I assume, going on, that they would manage native populations in some way, or certainly not overexploit them. But the concept of pollination, right? There was no the term pollinator didn't even exist. The idea of plant reproduction didn't even exist through pollination. And so at the time when people looked at flowers, this is what they thought. They thought that they had some sort of a spiritual significance or origin, that God put them here to please our senses. That was the purpose of a flower. And so, people would go out and they would collect flowers and bring them in because they were obviously pleasing all of our senses, visual, olfactory. And so this is into the 1600s. So even though the native peoples and the Europeans that followed were benefiting from the products of pollination, they had no clue about it whatsoever. Fast forward to 1793 or so, and we have a German by the name of Conrad Sprengel, who was the first to say, wait a second, I don't think these flowers are for us. I think they're for the animals that are visiting the flowers, the bees, the butterflies. I think there's some relationship between those two, and I think it has something to do with helping the plants to reproduce. So this is when the idea of pollination and the concept of a pollinator came into when we learned about it. This idea sat on the shelf because you can imagine if somebody's telling you that God put this here and no, this is here for insects, there's probably going to be a bit of conflict with that, right? And so Sprengel actually, it sort of sat on the shelf until somebody named Charles Darwin came around and read Sprengel's book and said, this is it. He was on the origin of the species. He refers to Sprengel's book and says, yes, plants. The animals are selecting for certain features in the plants, and that's why the flowers look the way they do, because those insects have a preference for color or smell, and those are being reflected in the flowers that we see. So it's actually a way to help plants reproduce. He worked on cross-pollination and selfing and all of pollination biology, which is what my talk's about, and that's, I guess, if you look at my expertise, it's in pollination biology, one of them. But that wasn't until 1859 that idea even came into being. We then move forward to the 1900s, and we get the Society for the Protection of Native Plants, which is Native Plant Trust now, and this is where Framingham comes back onto the scene. So what groups of people noticed that this practice of going into the wild and taking flowers and selling them in Boston was actually hurting native plants, right? So this is the first idea of conservation. This group also noted that non-natives were hurting our natives, that non-natives were coming in and replacing our non-natives, and that was going to be a problem. And they really wanted to focus on keeping that beauty that we have. And there was no mention of the pollination part of it or the pollinator part of it here. So this is the plant perspective. But then in 1900, this Nature's Garden book came out, and you notice, if you can read it up here, an aid to our knowledge of our wildflowers and their insect visitors. And in the preface of this book, they talk about the fact that insects help plants pollinate and that is important, okay? So that's how that got into the mainstream, our understanding. There's a lot of science, by the way, and so what I do is all about science and data and showing you using the data in a meaningful way. Everything that Sprengel did and Darwin they did experiments, right? They figured out, if I do this, I'm gonna cover this flower and not let an insect visit. I'm gonna let them visit this one, and look, this one can reproduce, this one can't. That type of thing. So simple experiments, very powerful, and looking at every species imaginable, you can come to the conclusion that there's something here. And Darwin develops his theory of natural selection out of what he saw, but some of the experiments that he did as well. All right, so then we move into the 1980s, where we introduce this term biodiversity. So people mention biological diversity, but we hear biodiversity every day. And if you look at the journals and when the term biodiversity, the frequency it was used, it goes through the roof. 1985, the field of conservation biology was born, right? So biodiversity is looking at variety of life at different levels. So you can look at species, you can look at genetic variety at the genetic level and also ecosystem level. Those are the three levels. What's interesting though is that when we talk about biodiversity loss, it's how many species did we lose, right? It's presented as the number of species in an area that were there that are no longer there. But species do not act in isolation, right? If we look at our fox here, we've got a squirrel that's eating berries or nuts from this bush, and then our fox is going to eat the squirrel. Or we've got a butterfly laying an egg that's eaten by a bird that's eaten by a hawk. So we see these connections or interactions. And this is very important. In these interactions, at the base, we have plants. Plants are providing the fuel for all these interactions. So the more plants we have, so they're bringing sun energy in, and they're pushing that energy through the system. So the more plants we have and the more diversity of plants we have, the more energy we have to feed all of these interactions. That notion of these networks, right, of interactions between species really didn't start to gain traction until the 1990s. So when we look at our plants now, so people are interested in plants, that's great, the plants in isolation. When we expand out to interactions or connectivity, we see that we've got herbivores that are eating the plants. We've got animals dispersing the seeds to help, the population to expand. We've got predators that are eating things that are eating the herbivores. We also have pollinators that are helping in the reproduction. We're going to focus here. But we've got all these interactions, positive and negative, happening with this plant. So these things don't happen in isolation. You can't study them in isolation or assume that they're happening without all of these other things going on. So when we look at biodiversity loss, it actually starts with degradation of these interactions. They get upset in some way that eventually leads to species loss. So how do plants reproduce? And this is where we get into, so that was my preamble. Hopefully I won't go too much over time, but hopefully that is I've done a good job of taking Framingham history and getting it into my talk in some way and the history of pollination biology in general. But the way that, so most flowering plants on the planet are flowering plants, and the way that flowering plants reproduce is through pollination. This is what Sprengel, there were a few before him, but Sprengel really brought everything together, this idea of pollination. And so you can think of, plants just like animals have male and female parts and gametes. And so the male gametes, you could think of pollen as the male gametes, are transferred to the stigma, which is the female reproductive organ. If this reproductive organ, the stigma, is receptive, right? And remember that word, it's extremely important in this, is receptive. We get pollen tube growth, fertilization, and then we eventually get the production of seeds and fruit. That process is called pollination, okay? Now, when I ask people, what's the definition of a pollinator? They say, well, it's an animal that transfers pollen. And I say, no, that's part of it, but that's not all of it. This is where the receptive part comes in. That's why I underlined it. Well, actually, I underlined the wrong part, but this is the outcome, which is also important. But the pollen transfer from stamens to the receptive stigma, the receptive part's important, leading to the production of seeds and fruit. The reason I underline this is because this is the connection. Ecologically speaking, conservation, the reason that I am up here and what I'm trying to tell you is extremely important is this connection to wildlife. It has nothing to do with the bees or the butterflies in isolation. It is the interaction between those bees and butterflies in the plant. It actually, pollination and pollinator is a plant-based term, has nothing to do with the animal. The animal's a flower visitor that, if it helps the plant, becomes a pollinator. It's not a pollinator just because it's on the flower. And this is the number one problem that I see with, I'm assuming these conservation groups are well-intended, but they've got things wrong when it comes to the definition and the important part. And it goes back to agriculture, and I'm not going to go into that in my talk. But for our purposes, this is the important part, receptive, because we get pollen transfer happening all the time that doesn't lead to reproduction, right? So if I have a plant, this lobelia, let's say it's self-incompatible, meaning that I can take pollen from this flower and give it to this flower, but we don't get, it's not receptive. It doesn't receive its own pollen. It can't reproduce with itself. So we get pollen transfer, but nothing happens reproductively. Also, I could take pollen from this plant and go to a plant of another species and nothing happens. So I've got pollen transfer. Do I have pollination? No, because I do not have the critical component down here. It needs to be receptive. If I take pollen here and go to an unrelated plant of the same species, which is called outcrossing, now I'm getting this, and now I'm getting pollination. And there's strong selection on plants to do this, because even if you can do this, the seeds aren't as good. They're lower quality for the most part, right? Everything in science isn't 100%. It's for the most part, and there are always exceptions, all right? But so outcrossing is what they want. And so the question then is, I'm a plant. Let's say I'm the donor plant. That's not my phone, I don't think. All right. So I'm the donor plant, and let's say the plant that I want to donate, so my mate, so obviously plants can't run around and find a mate like animals can, right? So you've got a problem. I need to mate with somebody over there, and I'm standing here, and I can't get my pollen over there, so what am I going to do? So the solution is some plants use wind, right? Some use water. So if you're growing on the bank of a stream, pollen floats downstream, or we get a good gust of wind in the right direction. The problem with that, it's very inefficient, right? Let's say the wind's blowing this way, and my pollen's ready, and it's all going over here, and then my mate's over here. Not much is going to happen. Same if the downstream, upstream. So the vast majority of flowering plants, to get around this problem, use animals to do the job, all right? And so there's strong selection for these plants to get those animals, to get that pollen and do this instead of this and this, okay? The reason we see so many different types of flowers is because there's a battle between the two, that they look and smell differently in different combinations. Each flower is like a fingerprint. They're all different. There are thousands of species, hundreds of thousands of species, different flowers, right? They differ at least one way. Most of the time they differ in multiple ways. And so that's what the plant wants the animal to do. And they entice the animal to do it by giving them nectar. So we flip the coin to the animal side. Who is doing the job? So globally, there are about 200,000 species that do the job, that function in some way as a pollinator of something. Not a single thing on this board, or globally, can pollinate everything. And there isn't a single plant species that can give nectar, supplies nectar to everything. Everything is subdivided. The reason we have so much diversity is because they have their own little, what's called a niche, depending on where you're from, where they have a certain set of tricks to help them to get that nectar. So it could be tongue length, but that diversity, each one has a little trick, but these are the groupings we have. 200,000 species globally, only 1,000 are vertebrates, like our hummingbird. We love our vertebrates, right? They're cute. Certainly this hummingbird's cute. We have one species in the East. But we have, thousands of bee species native to North America, right? And so here we're numbering hundreds and thousands. There are 50 species of bumblebee up here. All of them, in the backdrop, we see the environment. They're all competing for access to nectar, which is a limited resource. So they've all have different tricks. Behaviorally, they have long tongues, different features to help them to outcompete these other, to get access to the nectar. And then we have the plants that are trying to help them to do it. So we think about the animal and the plant as a single unit. They are not separate. The more than just the buzz in my title means it's actually about the plants, not the bees. It's about the relationship between those two, and we have to think of them as one thing. So as they're moving through collecting the nectar, if they transfer pollen in a way that leads to pollination, production of seeds and fruit, they're a pollinator. Otherwise, they're a flower visitor. So to show you, give you one example of this, here we have two bumblebee species on obedient plant. Bombus fervidus has a long tongue. It goes into the flower, makes contact with male and female reproductive parts, and pollinates leading to production of seeds and fruit. This is our pollinator. Here we have Bombus affinis biting a hole outside the flower, and stealing the nectar, which is located down here at the base of the tube. Flower visitor, certainly. Pollinator, no. In fact, this is a parasite from the plant's perspective, taking the reward without giving anything in return. And it's a cost, because when this bee takes the nectar, this bee comes in and says, hey, there's no more nectar here, I'm going somewhere else, and leaves this plant, and this plant then does not get pollinated. I could have thousands of bees, Bombus affinis. Bombus affinis, by the way, is our only bumblebee on the endangered species list. Is not a good pollinator of tubular flowers. It's a robber. It's a nectar robber, right? It does pollinate some things, but its way of competing against a long-tongued bee, because it has a really short tongue, is to bite a hole and steal it, and rather than go in because it can't reach it with its short tongue. Anyway, I could have thousands of our Bombus affinis. I can't use the term pollinator until I give it a plant that it actually pollinates. So this notion of pollinator-friendly plants, pollinated palousas, it's a complete, it's nonsensical, that term. You have animal pollinated plants, and they're either pollinated, meaning you have the animal there, or you do not. You cannot hope that Bombus affinis is going to pollinate. If the plant is there, that it pollinates, and it moves from this one to that one and does pollinate, then it's a pollinator, right? The reason that this term is misused is because in agriculture, when we say pollinator, we assume they're pollinating a crop plant. So that's the assumption. When we switch from agriculture to ecology, we have to make sure that the plants that match the animal are actually there. Now, it's not as simple as this. So here is an example. The pineland golden trumpet looks like this. Here's everything that was observed on the pineland golden trumpet visiting for nectar. We got all these skipper butterflies, non-skipper butterflies, short and long-tongued bees. The ones in green are the ones that are actually pollinating. So if I remove the 3 species, I've still got a dozen, tons of diversity, no pollination, right? No production of seeds and fruit. And we're going to see why I'm harping on this in a minute, why it's so important. This is the reason that we want to save these things is for this. Similarly, I could get rid of everything else and have low diversity, but have the 3 pollinators, and my system is intact, right? All right, so we can look then at the plant and all the animals that pollinate it, and we call that a pollination system. So the reason that I don't use the term pollinator in my talks, either use plant-pollen interaction or pollination system, is because it makes you think of the plant. In all of this, bee decline, save the bees, save the butterflies, people forget about the plant. They think that putting in a non-native plant because the animal's feeding is a good thing, but we lose the connection. We want to restore the native co-evolved connection because that's the diversity, right? And we're going to see how that diversity builds other diversity in a minute. But we have certain plants attracting small bees with short tongues. We have plants that are attracting long tongues or large-bodied bees like our bumblebee. Notice this white, that's all pollen. And so the plants deposit the pollen on the back of the bee. Why? Because it's very hard for that bee to groom off the pollen. That bee wants to eat that, take that pollen back and feed its young. That plant needs those gametes to reproduce. There's conflict. Everybody thinks plant pollinator systems is beautiful mutualism. It's a fight between the 2 of them. It's not a happy relationship. Each one wants different things. The animals don't care if plants reproduce. They want to eat, right? So this is the way that the plant maximizes its pollen transfer efficiency. It's also shown here in this hummingbird pollinated plant. The nectar's down here. The pollen's deposited on the forehead of the hummingbird. Why? Well, if I deposit it on its wings, I'm not going to have much pollen left, right? So it moves into place. Here's the female part. As it moves in to get the nectar, it rubs its forehead on the female part to maximize pollen transfer efficiency. Here, so a lot of systems are generalized. There's a highly specialized system. Here's a fly. Its tongue goes all the way down here below the screen. This flower tube goes all the way down here. That fly dies or goes extinct, the plant goes extinct. The plant goes extinct, the fly goes extinct. So it's a one-to-one relationship, highly specialized. Others have fail-safes where they're pollinated by a couple of species, often one better than the other, but they can get by with a backup. Here's a butterfly. All these specks you see are pollen grains. So plants are targeting certain animals. Bees certainly are important, but for some plants, they don't want bees. This plant is trying to deter bees because it wants hummingbirds. So there's a push and pull that's going on, and it's very complicated. And you got to sort out who's doing what, and in particular, who's doing the pollinating and who is not. So the reason that this is important, right? I talk about pollination products, the seeds and fruit produced, the plant material. That is supplying food, energy to the next trophic level, right? The seeds and fruit are eaten by small birds, and small mammals. Those small mammals are eaten by owls and predatory birds. So if you're into bird conservation, you should be worried about what's going on here with these pollination systems, because imagine you've got all these systems supplying a variety of different food items, nesting options, and shelter options to the next trophic level, which is then that diversity is supplying diversity up here. And so if we get rid of some connections for a particular food item that this predatory species likes, we get this cascading effect. It's called a bottom-up effect, right? And this is our foundation of a healthy and functional ecosystem. That's why we want the diversity of these pollination systems, because of these pollination products. So why should we care? And I get this, not so much now, but I used to get this a lot. Agriculture, it's clear why pollination is important, right? 1 out of every 3 bites of food we take, that's not the focus of this talk. I'm sure you've heard a lot about it. Honeybees are an important part of that system. They have no business in the ecology side. There's no native plant that needs a honeybee. They've evolved somewhere else and they have their own systems, but they're not here, all right? So they're competitors from an ecological perspective. They're certainly important crop pollinators, but they're not in the system, right? So the reason that as we start to erode the bottom layer, we start to see the collapse of these systems. So eventually we might lead to ecosystem collapse, but all of these ecosystem services we get from nature for free. So pollination is important for agriculture. That's one context. Pollination is important ecologically because of all of this. And so water purification, carbon sequestration, clean air, all of this, just walking and taking a nature walk and like looking at bird diversity or just listening to things and seeing a lot of native diversity around you, that's an ecosystem service. When we lose this, because we lose the connections, we can't replace, and there's a hefty price tag. So people say, well, we know how much it's going to cost if we lose pollinators in agriculture. Who cares if we lose a couple bees that aren't important in agriculture? This is why. Because we take this for granted and we can't replace it. And go to China where they got rid of all their pollinators and they're hand pollinating their apple trees and using drones to drop pollen because they screwed up the system. They have to figure out how they're going to fix it. All right. So we don't want to get there. And so all of these little things, even though they seem insignificant, collectively keep all of this going for us. All right. That's my mission, is to help you to understand the connection between the bees and plants and the birds and then clean air type thing. All of it is linked together, that systems level approach that I talked about. Now, the problem is that, and I'm sure you've heard about this, is these systems are being degraded at an alarming rate worldwide, both from the plant side and the animal side of the equation. So looking at just bumblebees, so those are the black and yellow fuzzy ones that we see. I showed you on a couple slides ago. Looking at historical data and current data, we can see that there are many species that are in decline. Bombus affinis is the one I showed you that's on the endangered species list. It's likely been locally extinct in Massachusetts and throughout most of the Northeast. Butterflies, though, it's the same thing. Tons of species in decline. And not surprisingly, a bunch of native plants, 593 native plants that are threatened, endangered, or believed to be in decline. Many of these plants, like this penstemon, are pollinated by the animals that are also in decline. And that shouldn't be shocking to you either, right? We get declines here. We don't get enough pollination here. This is going to suffer, right? So it's a two-way street. What people don't realize, and this is another major problem, is everything is not in decline. There are things certainly headed in the direction of the extinction, local extinction, but we also have species that numbers have exploded. Their distributions they've increased their distributions. They are very common now. So species, we've got two groups, the species that were common once that are in decline. We've got species that were once abundant, but are really abundant and very widespread and common now. That's very different. So a species that was very abundant and widespread to one that's got a smaller population that's in decline is different than a rare species, right? There are certain species that just occur in small areas in low numbers That's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about species that were all over the place that are now, populations are starting to really be reduced and bottleneck, and there's a major problem with that. But there are also species, so this difference is the problem. There isn't a one size fits all. Clearly, if in each of these species has a different set of needs, if I'm meeting the needs of the common species and ignoring the ones that, the needs of the species that need it, that's a problem. And because there's differential declines, it shows you that they're responding to whatever we're doing to screw them up. Some don't care and actually like it, and others really don't like it. And we got to figure out why they're different, right? That's my job as a researcher, is to figure out what's going on. And so there are a number of causal factors that have been proposed. So my lab studies all these things, not so much climate change, although I'm aware of it. And I just got a call about Earth Day and talking about climate change. So I need to do more research here, but it's difficult to do. But I did go on and on about everything else I'm doing, of course. Pesticides, so we've studied pesticides. So with the pesticides, the issue is more, so obviously it's in urban areas and agricultural areas that are using the pesticides. There are many areas where we see decline where these pesticides aren't present, but they certainly don't help. Their negative effects. They alter the behavior of the bee, which alters their ability as a pollinator. So I'm not going to talk much about that today. Non-native species, so both plants and pollinators, are contributing infectious disease or infectious agents, new diseases. So diseases are moving from honeybees to bumblebees and other native bees. So that's an issue. But the biggest driver is habitat change. So destruction combined with the introduction of non-native species. And so that's where I'm gonna focus today. So focusing on areas where we've degraded landscapes. It's not like it used to be. What do we need to do to get it back, to restore it? All right. So a lot of words here, but again, we're focused on these pollination systems and diversity, which I call functional diversity, right? Because each of those systems is contributing to our web of life, all that wildlife together. So how do we restore the ecological functioning and get the range of those systems back to where they used to be, or to where we can start to see some changes in terms of function. So before I get there, we have to talk about goals. I talked about goals at the beginning of the talk. The goal here is restoring the functioning, which is the plants and pollinators together. And hopefully you can see at this point why those two are important. So I use this example, and everybody at the end of the talk is like, oh, I feel terrible. I use hummingbird feeders all the time. I could put bees up here, but this example hits home, so I continue to use it. So hummingbirds are moving into the area this time of the year. People put up feeders thinking they're going to starve, but hummingbirds eat insects. Hummingbirds, can feed on tree sap. They figured it out. They've been here far longer than we have, and they can get by. But anyway, if you're a hummingbird, right? So we've got our monarda that they also feed on, and this is a hummingbird pollinated plant. We've got our feeder, and you're a bird, and you have two options. Which one are you going to take? I mean, birds aren't, you've heard bird brain, but birds aren't stupid. One, stop shopping, you fill up, go back, feed your young, reduce your chance of predation. You got a high quality food source that's never ending. I mean, of course you're going to go here, right? So we keep our birds are very happy. We're saving the birds, we're saving the pollinators. Over here, we put in monarda, it pollinates the monarda. Monarda is a host plant for the orange mint moth, right? So we got the larval stage and the adult stage. We've got birds that love to eat butterfly larvae. We've got birds that love to eat monarda seeds. We've got birds that love to eat adult orange mint moths. So by putting in this plant, look at all the biodiversity that I'm supporting. All of this. I do this, I save one species, right? So, and I cut all of this out. Replace my feeder with a non-native plant. The birds may even pollinate it. They might like the nectar. The problem is none of our butterflies want to use it as a host plant because it's chemically different and they don't like it. The birds don't want to nest in it. The birds don't want to eat the seeds. So effectively, you're cutting all of this out as well, even though you might even have pollination going on and the birds are happy. This is the problem with the non-natives. We have systems that they've co-evolved to like each other, to fit. And even though they may fit to some degree here, there's nothing that can do 100% swap. Remember that first slide I showed you with the plant and all those interactors? That's shaping that plant. They've got defensive compounds. They've got things, they're manipulating their interactors in different ways. There's no native plant that can fit that because it doesn't have the same selection pressures. So even though it's doing something here, everything it's not going to be able to perform all these other functions, right? So that's the problem. So this is our feeder. We want to move to this. And it doesn't take much Monarda to replace this and get all of this. Surprisingly little, we're finding. So the idea then that I have is we're going to focus on the needs of the imperiled species. Why do the common species are doing well? Clearly, they have what they need. But what do the imperiled species need? What is it that's missing that we need to replace? And so there are a number of different things that could be missing to keep the population going. So for all of our insects, they need a place to overwinter. They need, when they come out in the spring, they need a place to nest, or they need a host plant, depending if you're a bee or a butterfly. You need foraging habitats. You need a source of nectar or pollen. So nectar is their source of fuel. Pollen is the source of protein. So if you're a bee, you can't make more bees without pollen, right? You can live for a long time on nectar because it's your energy. If you run out of nectar and you have pollen, if you're a bee, you live about 24 hours, right? So very different, but both important. The bees look for a nest site. They start collecting pollen, make pollen, but depending on the type of bee. The larvae eat the pollen, they pupate and they come out, they reproduce, and then they go back in overwintering, right? So we want to make sure that we have all of those elements taken care of. Butterflies need a host plant for reproduction and a nectar plant for food. So they're feeding in both cases. These two things aren't the same. And I'm telling you, you can have all the most beautiful butterfly garden in the world. If you don't have the host plant for that butterfly, you will not see it, right? So if you're trying to attract a butterfly, you better have combos or you're not gonna be successful. And I see a lot of this. The plants, right? We need to know for the plants that are in decline, who are the pollinators? How important is pollination to them? Animal pollination, or are they selfing? And which pollinators are important? Who are their main pollinators? It's shocking to me. 1900s, Society for the Protection of Native Plants. 1900, we understand that animals are important for plant pollination. This is not studied. The vast majority of plants that we have that are in decline or state listed, we don't know how important pollination is to them, and we don't know who the pollinators are. And it's a very easy set of experiments that I'm going to go over and show you for one of the species on this that's state listed, how easy it is to determine these things, to figure out if that's a driving factor in decline, right? It's just, let's let it sit there, we'll protect, and it may go extinct or not, but we're not really going to try to figure things out. And I just have a different approach. So the traditional approach then, and this is from the state, this is a seed mix from the state, and I've underlined supporting native pollinators across the Commonwealth, right? And I'm not picking on the state. I could have picked Native Plant Trust. I could have picked Xerces Society. I can pick a list from anywhere, and it's the same problem across the board, is that I don't know how they come up with these lists, but it's not based on any sort of science that I've seen, right? So we look at so I've color-coded everything in here. So clearly, our pollinators only need non-tubular flowers, because the only tubular flower in there, I'd consider it a medium tube flower is blazing star, right? We'll come back to this list in a minute, but this makes you think, so the grasses are important for nesting, important host plants, but in terms of nectar plants, it's all non-tubular, right? So let's go out and ask our bumblebees, does this fit your dietary needs? Are you going to be able to survive on this list that I'm paying money to put out and promote all over the state? So here are the bumblebee species native to our region, the social ones, then put the parasitic ones up here. This one, so these two are targets. This is the endangered species, probably local extinct. This one is alive and well, and I've been studying populations in the West. It used to be all over the Cape, but it's no longer there. It's pushed to higher elevations. The two that are in this area that I'll focus on, this one, Bombus fervidus, this one, Bombus vagans. So what I did is I went out to multiple sites. So Breakneck Hills one, that's 40 acres, similar sites across the state. I started collecting data on bumblebee flower interactions. What were they doing? Were they collecting nectar or pollen? Was it a queen, worker, or male? And at this point, I've got over 20,000 observations, controlled transects, very sciencey. In addition to that, I created the Ecology Citizen Science Project, where people could go out and take a short video of an interaction, and it goes into our database, and I can compare the citizen science data to my more rigorously collected data to see if there are some consistencies between those two. So this is interaction I'm studying. Just to look at behavior, you need video. So iNaturalist is great, but it's a still. You can't tell if a bee is collecting nectar or pollen from iNaturalist. You need to see the behavior. So that's why this app is so important and giving me 5 to 10 second videos. I can figure it out and slow it down, but I know the behavior. And as we'll see, this was critical. That video was critical to understanding the needs of these bumblebees of conservation concern. So based on all the data, I came up with the list, right? Early version of the list. So the list is all data driven and it changes. It will be changing again very shortly because I have a whole bunch of butterfly data, which I'll talk about from last year. Some of the bee plants will change, and more importantly, the targets for butterflies have changed because they just published a paper listing the status, conservation status of all the butterflies in the state. So I know which ones are the targets and who's declining and who isn't. And so I'm getting all those data together, which I'll add to the list that I currently have. So that's a work in progress. Anyway, we find that here are, for those 2 long-tongued bumblebees, here's what they like. From spring, wood betony, all the way through to showy goldenrod in the fall. Highly preferred. So what we do is we go out, we survey the available resources, and then we look at what they're doing, and we compare what they're doing to what's available. And we see that they're doing things way beyond the availability, and in some cases they're doing way less. So we can figure out the preferences of the species in that way by looking at the observed and the expected, if you will. Pollen sources are completely different than the nectar. So here is pollen sources, as I said, to make new bees all the way through the season. So these are just some of the plants on the list, but you'll notice for nectar, every one of these is a tubular flower, every single one of them. Blazing Star could be in here and definitely is used by these two, but Blazing Star is blooming in July, August, and these bees are out from April through October. So we feed them nectar, no pollen, for a couple weeks. Do we think that that's helping? No, it is not. So to keep those bees going, this is what they want. This is one of the targets, Bombus vagans on a prunella. So we know what the bees want. We also, I took a look, this is my grad student, Chelsea Hettering. The previous slide was my grad student, Ellen Pierce. So what we looked at 2 penstemon species, Digitalis and Hirsutus. This one is the one that is in decline. So we asked a couple questions. First of all, how important is animal pollination to them? And secondly, who's important? Who are the pollinators, the major pollinators of these plants? So the way you do that is you get the plants, you bag them when they're about to bloom. Some of them you leave the bag on so they can't get exposed to animals. Some of them you open and you let them get exposed to animals. Some of them you open and you watch who's visiting, and then you tie up the bag, you wait till they go to seed, and you count the number of seeds or you weigh the fruit, right? And so the results in terms of how important are pollinators, like animals, to their reproduction, extremely important, right? No visits in our bag controls, no seeds are produced. So if they don't have animals to pollinate them, they're not producing seeds. And it's interesting, as I was reading Bob, on a website, Bob Villas saying, penstamon's great. It's the most prolific seed producer of all plants. Well, guess what? You better hope you haven't used pesticides to kill everything off, because you're going to be in this category where it's not going to produce anything, right? So we see that visitors are important. What's really interesting is when you look at who's important, so this is the percent, on this axis is the percent functioning as pollinators, where they transferred enough pollen to start producing seeds. We see that in small bees, less than 20% of them are leading to pollination. There's a lot less seed production here than bumblebees. But even if we look within bumblebees, Bombus impatiens, which is really common, this is one of the species of conservation concern, and this is another long-tongued species, are doing most of the pollinating. They're benefiting the plant the most. So we see differences not only between bee groups, but between bee species. And this is extremely important information when you're trying to figure out why penstemon is in decline. Because if this species is gone and can't pollinate and this one isn't around, the seed production's going down from the plant's perspective, but also think of it as food. There's less food available for birds and small mammals too, right? So this information is important. All right, so with this information in hand, we then went, so phase one is figure out what they want. Phase two is, well, let's put it back into areas where it's not present and see if it has an impact. And so I have my main sites in Southborough. Thank you to Freddie, who's here. Rehoboth is another big site in Dartmouth, but I have, sites and people working, putting in these plantings, all over the place, which is great to see, and I really, really appreciate. But if we look, so we'll focus just on the impact that putting these plants has on those two bumblebee species of conservation concern, then we'll switch to butterflies briefly. Here are the bumblebee species. The two that are circled are the ones that are in trouble. So my grad student, Ellen Pierce, walked transects starting in May, every week all the way through to October. Didn't see a single Bombus fervidus on the transects. So very, very low numbers. Bombus vagans saw 12 over the entire season. Look at the number of impatiens, 4,319. This is the one that is all over the place. And when people say, oh, this plant's a bee magnet, a bumblebee magnet, it's 4,000 of one species that you're seeing instead of 5 or 6 that you're supposed to be seeing, right? This difference between abundance and diversity is extremely important. So a number of things went on. So there was some loosestrife here that was removed and some native plants came up, but one of the things that was done was selective mowing. So identifying the native plants that we want to keep and mowing around them instead of just mowing everything to the ground. Mowing everything to the ground delays bloom, if they bloom at all. So I looked at selective mowing, and I actually do this at my house as well. And I'll talk about that later. But anyway, here's Beecology. Here's where here's the change. So here's 40 acres. We put plant material down in here, right? Small plants. As soon as we did that first year, a number of plants bloomed. The next year, the showy goldenrod bloomed. But as soon as those plants bloomed, we started to see the targets show up. Where we had 0, all of a sudden, these are all pictures of bees on those sites visiting the plants that we put in that weren't there before. It was shocking to me how quickly those bees showed up after we put in the plants, right? I didn't expect that. I expected things to need to develop. They were there right away, just to emphasize the preference. And there's not a lot of it there. It's a small patch of prunella, and all of a sudden, the Bombus vagans shows up. They clearly have a high preference. And so we look a couple years later, here are the numbers over a couple of years. Bombus fervidus was 0. We now have seen 50 over the last couple of years. We're averaging about 20 a year, where we saw 0 for multiple years or a handful. Bombus vagans up 67%. But look at Bombus impatiens. This is where it was historically, 400. It's in balance with everything else. It's not 4,000 to 0. Everything is even. That shows you that it's a healthy system. It's in the balance that it used to be historically. And I could go back to that slide and show you the historical relative abundances, but it's very similar to what we're seeing here. That means that we're headed in the right direction when it comes to the bumblebees. Now, the one thing that we noticed too, why do we see more numbers? Are they all over the place, or are we increasing the population? At Breakneck, the one thing they had a lot of was red clover. So these long-tongued bees, the red clover was introduced in the 1600s. Probably as soon as people got to Framingham, they plowed fields and threw in red clover. It's been here forever. The problem with red clover, so the bumblebees like it, but it's got low-quality pollen. So we introduced these ones, Penstemon pedicularis, St. John's wort, high-quality pollen from a bumblebee's perspective. They have lower quality pollen. Higher quality pollen means more reproductives, more bees we can put out because we've got better food. And so that's what I think is driving the increase in the population. There were other changes as well. It could have to do with nesting, but it's certainly encouraging, and this could explain at least some of it. By the way, no mow May. Let's keep the dandelion. Dandelion is a terrible resource. Let me just say that the vast majority of things on flowers are opportunistic, which means they're not going to starve. They're going to visit something. But you can think of it like fast food. When you're driving down and starving, you'll eat McDonald's. And you'll keep eating McDonald's if there's nothing else available. But if something else becomes available, you'll probably switch from McDonald's to something that's more preferred that isn't going to make your stomach, not to bash McDonald's, but I think you know where I'm headed with this, right? That they will eat, they're not going to starve, but they do better. They prefer it for a reason, for whatever reason. I'm trying to figure out why do they like certain plants over others? And it's about the chemistry probably and other things in the nectar. And I'm working with somebody at Cornell to figure these things out. But it's lower, the non-natives are lower quality. So it's what's called an ecological trap. It pulls them in and says, hey, yeah, I'm here. There's a lot of me, come and, feed on me, but it's a slow burn. You're just able to keep your head above water with the pollen quality, but you can't grow the population because it limits you because it's a lower quality. All right. Okay, so we go back to our seed mix that we're going to save all of Massachusetts pollinators. This nectar is July, August. It's not going to, these two, I've seen, they don't highly prefer, but certainly Blazing Star is not a bad thing from these two perspectives. But again, it's July, August, and they need nectar. It doesn't supply nectar or pollen. It's not a good pollen plant for them, not preferred. So we're missing most of their life cycle. So now I'm going to switch. So we've sort of figured things out, or we're moving forward with planting and looking at doing pre-post tests to see what impact we're having through the Citizen Science Project. So we did the same. I had a grad student do the same thing with butterflies, and I'm sure the same thing happens with everything. Birds. It doesn't matter. Every animal species is going to show a preference for something over something else for a reason because of those interactions and those coevolutionary relationships that I talked about, right? It makes perfect sense ecologically speaking. So recently, this paper was published in Science that has the butterfly species in the Northeast that are in decline. So here's a list of them. This is going into my list along with what's their host plant, what nectar plants do they like, right? So here's the list we have. So my grad student went out to 4 sites to collect data on butterflies. So you get what you get, right? We at this point, we're just trying to get diverse habitat types to try to get as many butterfly species as we can. And so the 4 sites that we selected, Borden Colony, Breakneck Hill, DNRT, which is in Dartmouth, and Norcross Wildlife Sanctuary. So looking at non-tubular flowers, so looking at the floral landscape, the vast majority of flowers were those non-tubular flowers that were on that list that I showed you. The number of native species varied. So Norcross works hard to get a lot of natives on site. So they're way up here. Borden Colony is basically an abandoned field, and they just let it go. So there's very fewer natives there. Breakneck is up there because we've been trying to work on the increasing the native plant diversity over time. DNRT is a community garden. So the sites were quite large, 5,000 to 25,000 meters squared. But if we look at what the butterflies were doing as a group, right? So here's the long tube flowers available, 20%. You see it's pretty low. Here's the long tube flowers that were visited by butterflies as a group. So butterflies as a group have a very strong preference for tubular flowers. Across sites, there was consistency across sites. And we'll look at species as well. There was consistency there. But we go back to our plant list that's saying, hey, let's plant black-eyed Susan. Let's plant all goldenrod. Those, we'll see those were not preferred. In fact, they were under-visited by the butterflies. What was extremely interesting, so all of these species, common ringlet, Delaware skipper, and northern broken dash, here's the percent that they're declining based on that table that I showed you from the recent data. So 98% reduction in northern broken dash. Luckily, we saw northern broken dash at our sites, but only sites that had long tube native flowers because that's what they prefer. That Borden Colony site had no native long tube flowers. We did not see northern broken dash. It was only Norcross and Breakneck where they had those long tube flowers. The northern broken dash is only in flight from July through August. So unless you have those tubular flowers at that time when they need it, you're going to miss the window, right? Delaware skipper, also preference for long tube flower, but could do native, non-native. But at the other end of the spectrum, we have common ringlet. There were 5 or 6 species that showed a strong preference for non-tubular flowers. They're on the fleabanes. They're on the milkweeds, right? They're on Joe Pye wheat and a lot of non-natives. So this should show, just like the bumblebees, there is not a one-size-fits-all. You have to look, even with the targets, there's variation. I think it's interesting that the species in decline, especially the skippers, are in flight for a very short period of time and seem to show a preference for long tubular native flowers, and we're looking into that. But the next step then is, let's load these up and the host plants and see if we can increase populations of northern broken dash, and we can fix things, right? As a group, if you each put the host plant and some of the Monarda or Prunella, that could sustain butterflies, right? They just need enough to lay eggs. They need the host plants there, and you're good to go. Unlike the bumblebees that have a bottomless pit for a stomach and they just can keep going, going, going. You need more floral resource. For the solitary bees and butterflies, you don't need as much. And so let's compare that to the European skipper. So not surprisingly, the European skipper also, they both love long tube flowers. European skipper, almost exclusively non-natives. Surprise, surprise, a European butterfly preferring European plants, they've co-evolved, you would expect it, right? But what's interesting, in the same habitats, they have access to the same resources, they're partitioning. We see the northern broken dash on the tubular flowers that are native, and the European skipper over here. We get the complete separation, which was quite interesting. So we go back to our list, right? I think I've got these slides. Let me do this slide first, and then I'll go back to that other slide. That's my big finish. So we look at the highly preferred, more than expected. If we look at plants in general, so milkweeds were definitely up there. Prunella liatris and Monarda officiosa, so medium to long tube, were really good for most butterfly species, but not all. There were some that preferred the non-tubular flowers. But what was really interesting is black-eyed Susan. Everybody loves it. Oh, every pollinator list I've seen has black-eyed Susan. Black-eyed Susan, especially when these other things are around, is empty. There's nothing. I've seen a field this size, all black-eyed Susan, not a single thing on it, right? So why is it on the list is the question. But the asters and goldenrods, and native is good. I'm not saying don't put native plants in. What I'm saying is, if your goal is to help those native pollination systems that are in trouble, this is not going to help. And they're under visiting for a reason, right? So we go back to our list, and who do we see? Black-eyed Susan, goldenrod, and aster are on there. So we throw those in. This one's going to establish quickly, and it's going to be all over the place and look great to us, but look at things through the eyes of the animals, right? They have needs and preferences, so we got to shift our view from what we think's beautiful to what they think's beautiful, right? And that's going to take data to understand what they like, and then we change our lists accordingly and get more science, more evidence-based lists. So what do I do at home? So I have neighbors here, and I appreciate it, and I'm going to wrap up soon. I know I tend to ramble on, but they've seen and they've questioned what I'm doing, because I'm not a landscape designer and I'm not a gardener. So it's sort of, I got things around and I say, well, some of them are state listed, and these are really helping. I'm like, oh, sure they are. My wife just said the other day, you better trim this down. I'm sick of seeing this. The house is going up for sale next door. I'm like, well, fine. If they don't like it, tough for them. It gives me an excuse not to cut the grass too, because there's not much grass to cut. But anyway, I was able to put all these plant species are on my property. And I will say this picture is Bombus vagans, a target on my lawn, visiting Prunella. I live not even a mile from Garden in the Woods, and I've surveyed Garden in the Woods a number of times. I'd be lucky to see one. Last year I had about a dozen of these on my small 1/4 acre, because I have these two are huge. This one's huge. These three, these are the big three. This one's important too. I mean, I can't, it's like Sophie's Choice, right? But these three are certainly, to get them out of the gate, pollen quality wise and preference, these two going into this one really increases numbers. Pollen source, this one, purple flowering raspberry. My purple flowering raspberry is blooming for like 2 months, and it is covered with everything. This is a major pollen source. But all of these are good. St. John's wort. But notice the willows are coming out now, and that rolls in to each one of these rolls in so there are no gaps. The other thing that I'm doing is the selective mowing I talked about in 40 acres, I'm also doing at home. So my lawn's crappy, right? But here's the positive. See these holes? Yeah. Ground nesting bees. You have turf grass with no holes, you get no bees, right? They have bare soil, sandy soil, that's what they dig into. So this is better. And once I saw this, I'm like, okay, well, I'm going to deal with this, and people are going to have to just be disgusted when they walk by my house. The other thing is that I had tons of white clover. White clover, honeybees love white clover, and the common bumblebees, but the skippers hate it, the native skippers, and this bumblebee species doesn't like it at all, or as much. Certainly, I see one or two when they're starved. I mow around, so I threw seed down, prunella seed, grows up, and instead of mowing it down, I just mow around it. So we've got a beautiful looking plant that's covered with, here's a picture of Bombus vagans, the target. Here are two skippers that I hadn't seen before because they love prunella. So you can just mow around things. Put seed around the base of a tree and mow around it. That's about as artsy as I get. Looks good and purple. I try to keep a nice circle, you know, but you could do a better job. But the point is that we can make our property functional and not do much and still have a big impact. It does not take 40 acres. You saw how small ecology is at Breakneck. And you saw the numbers from that small change. You do not need to change 40 acres. You need to change a small amount in the right way, not a large amount in the wrong way, right? So second to last slide. This is just from last year. So American Lady is on the list. I don't have the decline here, but it's certainly declining by, let's say, 60% or something. Likes those long tube flowers, but this is the host plant, Pearly Everlasting Pussy Toes. So I said to Freddie and Freddie's group and people that support the ecology that I love and appreciate, let's get some of this in the ground and see what happens. Every single person that put in the Pussy Toes or Pearly Everlasting started to see the American Lady larvae eating their plants up. And so a lot of people think, well, they're eating my plants, I'm going to spray them. But that's a good thing. Ecologically speaking, I mean, unless it's one of the invasive ones, it's a good thing. You want them to eat. But once they become adults, they're looking for this long tube. So let's plant Monarda and plant this. And so this is what I'm encouraging this year. I want to see a lot of this. And then we can go out and see if we've increased American Lady populations. And if we have, we bottle it up, tell everybody, spread it across the state. And we see those negative numbers getting to 0 and positive in terms of population. I absolutely think it's doable. People have to be smart about it. And you sort of have to ask questions. When you go into, garden in the woods and you ask for plants, you don't want cultivars. You don't want nativars because things are altered in a way that something isn't going to like. And I cut that out of my talk because I could go on for 3 years with different things. But trust me that you can't cover everything. When you change a plant, you're changing not just the flower, you're changing the chemistry, you're changing everything, which is making it less attractive to other things. And we want to stay away from that. Finally, I mentioned that the goal is building blocks for biodiversity. What we're starting to see, and I'm going to start to study more, is here's at Breakneck Hill, here's Bombus vagans getting pollen from St. John's wort, native St. John's wort, helping out this bumblebee of conservation concern. Fast forward to the fall, here we have a white-throated sparrow, which is a species of conservation concern, eating the seeds. So the products of this pollination, the same plant or a similar plant, because they like to nest, they need low ground cover, and they like to eat seeds close to the ground. This matches their needs. And so you'll see if you visit Breakneck, and hopefully you can stop by one of these sites in the summer, you're going to see birds and tons of life, tons of diversity, and it's because of those native plant hubs. Those birds are eating the larvae from the butterflies that are able to use them as a host plant, and the nectar sources are there that they like. Everything is together, right? Everything. We're creating systems and maintaining them. That's the goal, all right? And with that, I'd like to thank you very much, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Well,
Well, that was just great. Wow. So,
I apologize for going over time.
oh, don't worry about that. Is this on? Now it's on. So, for anybody who has questions, we're going to hand you the microphone because we are recording this, and without a microphone, you won't be picked up. So, who has a question? All right, I'm going to come down and hand you the microphone.
Hi, thank you. That was a great talk. You quickly mentioned no mow May and dandelions and
Yes.
went somewhere else. So could you speak to that a little bit, please?
Yeah, so no mow May is a major problem. And the reason for that is when you don't, there are a couple of problems with it. If you know you have a ton of native plant diversity that you're mowing, no mow Mays, that's okay. The non-natives coming up like dandelion and the white clover, which is what's coming up at that time, really isn't benefiting very much whatsoever. You're helping honeybees like a lot of non-natives. You're not helping the targets, and so it's sort of giving you a false sense. The other thing is, even if you were helping to some degree, once June hits and you mow it down, those species are depending on that resource, and you're immediately getting rid of it, right? So it's much better to put in some of the plants that I talked about and just leave them and have that as a resource rather than the no mow May. It really, if you look at what's visiting those plants, like dandelion's low quality, it's much better to swap it out with a prunella or something else. And if you do that and choose not to mow, great, but you shouldn't mow those resources at all. Like, it should be no mow, period. You know. So.
We have another question here.
Yeah. Hi.
If you were to add the native plants that you're recommending, do you recommend that they kind of clump a variety of them in a certain location, or can you just, put them in pots and intersperse them into your landscaping?
Yeah, so I mean, you want to get a half decent population size just so that they'll persist on your land. But how you do that, it really doesn't, like whether you have one here and one over there, like a different species close to one another or far apart, the animals will sort it out. So it's not, I'm working on the minimum amount that you need to be able to support something. And I'd say that a square meter, again, I'm from Canada, is around what, like the minimum that I'm seeing where you could support a bumblebee worker over its life, which is like 2-3 weeks. But as I said, with the butterflies and the smaller bees, that's more than enough for them because their needs aren't quite what a bumblebee's needs are. Like they can deal with less of a resource because they're just foraging for themselves and fewer offspring. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Okay. Yes.
All right. I missed the pollinator nectar thing. So that's really simple. I just missed it. I can look it up. But if you could say something about that. But I have a whole field of black-eyed Susans.
Yep.
And I thought it was so cool. It was so great. And I have a lot of coreopsis and that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So what would you do if you had land that was a lot of black-eyed Susans? What could I do?
Right. So excellent question. So I missed the first question. It was about pollinator definition.
I just didn't hear the definitions.
Right. So an animal that transfers pollen in a way that leads to plant reproduction. So the fertilization and the production of seeds and fruit, because there are animals that will transfer pollen that won't lead to that.
Right.
And what we want is the production of seeds and fruit because that's the functional importance of that event, that pollination.
Yeah.
So we want to make sure that the animals are there to complete that process. And so we need to separate them out because a lot of what we see on a plant isn't necessarily benefiting the plant. They're benefiting themselves by stealing the nectar or eating the pollen.
But how are pollen and nectar different? That's what I was confused about.
Sorry. So in the plant, there's a nectar, like a structure that secretes sugar water. So
Okay.
the nectar is sugar water, and the pollen is like the powder that you see.
Okay.
The nectar isn't involved in reproduction. The pollen is the male gametes that has to find the female reproductive organ. So
Okay.
the animal helps that happen.
Yep.
But animals aren't just going to go to a flower and help plants reproduce. So the nectar gets them there, and then the plant, depending on the animal, has the pollen and the male and female parts positioned in a way that helps the animal to transfer while they're eating the nectar.
Okay.
Right? So they're separate things. But to complicate things, things are trying to eat the pollen too. Like bees are trying to steal the pollen to eat it, and the plants don't want that. And so there are different forces at work, if you will. But those two are separate. Nectar's liquid. If you open up a flower or squeeze a flower, tubular flower at the end, if you pick it off, that bulb of liquid you see is nectar. And if you put your tongue to it, it would be sweet.
Okay. So getting back to the black-eyed Susans. Thank you.
So it's a good question because I often get, well, I have a whole bunch of non-natives like red clover. Should I just mow it? And the answer is absolutely no, right? You should not do that. What you do is introduce the native, get it established, and then you can start to pull back on the less preferred. So you should keep your black-eyed Susan, especially if you like them. I don't have a problem with that. And again, I'm not telling people you do what you want to do.
And I don't mow them. Yeah.
But if you were to take half of that and put some of these other things in, then that would be a good solution to what you have. You could keep the black-eyed Susan and just use some of that space to add these other things.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I'll come back.
Thanks so much for the fascinating talk. I had a question about goldenrods and asters, because in all the literature I've read, goldenrods and asters are the best flowers when it comes to host plants, because they support the most amount of different kinds of species as host plants. And so I found a little bit of your presentation kind of challenging from that standpoint. And I was wondering if you could speak to those two species.
Yep. So I think you're referring to Doug Talmey's work, probably. Yes. So we are on the same page with things. I'm not sure, like looking at the host plants of the butterfly species on that list, if you go through that list, most of it's grasses. The skippers are using grasses as a host plant. I'm not sure that there are any on there that would specifically use goldenrod and aster as a host plant. So I'd have to look at the data to support that. And he may be talking about other areas. I'm talking about Massachusetts and Northeast. That said, if they're host plants, they're important. I'm talking about nectar sources, right? So again, what is the function of the plant? And as I said, all native plants are good, but it's the function. So if you have a butterfly species that uses goldenrod as a host plant, it should be there, or aster. But you need the nectar plant it prefers as well, because those two keep the population going. You can't just have one or the other. And if you think that putting in goldenrod, they're going to feed on goldenrod, if their flight time is in June, the plant material's there, but the flowers aren't. So you have to separate out ecological need. That is the point of what I'm saying. I'm not saying the goldenrod and aster are not important. As a nectar source, they're undervisited. They will be visited, but when you look at butterflies, the only exception is showy goldenrod. When I look at showy goldenrod, it's covered with monarchs and everything else. When I look at fields, literally acres and acres of goldenrod, I might see maybe one or two. It's covered with honeybees and common eastern bumblebee. There's not a lot of diversity there, native diversity. So whatever the role is, if it plays that role and it hosts a lot, you should keep it. I'm not saying to get rid of it. I'm just saying we need to have a strategy for what are we trying to help and what stage are we trying to help, and we need to complete everything. And I'm filling in the nectar foraging gap. Okay? Does that help to bring Doug and I together? We are. I don't have any problem. It's just it's the same message, just slightly twisted. I'm more pollinator, he's more host plant. It's the same idea, that there are differences and important things that we need to consider and maximize. Like Monarda for nectar is the plant you put in to maximize diversity, right? That's his oak. It's a host plant for like 1,000 things. Monarda supports the greatest diversity of bees and butterflies that I've seen. Monarda. If you had to, that or the penstemons, yeah. And tell Doug I told you to plant Monarda. Ask him the same question. Say, well, this guy says that Monarda is important as a nectar source.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Okay. Where would you suggest that you get seeds if you're just interested in starting this whole process?
Another excellent
where do you buy?
question. So Freddie's sitting right, Freddie Gillespie, who's, she runs we do. So all of the sites that I have, because the money, I use it for research, but I've supported the plants in some way, or people are just supporting me in general, do seed collections every year and seed exchanges. And then they do winter sow events. So that number is growing. I think, didn't you say you start? Somebody told me that they were starting one this year. I know Freddie has them and it's expanding. So you can get them as a part of these seed exchanges, or I can get you plants. Just email me and tell me what you want. I have nurseries all over the state. I have every plant covered on my list, and I'll be able to get you what you need. But in terms of Freddie, do you want to just quickly say? Do you want to quickly say what you're?
Here.
Or I can say it for you if you want.
In Southborough, we collect the seeds, and then and many of the people from the Framingham Garden Club help this year, and we clean and package them, and then we give them away, and then we show people how to sow them in milk jugs because they need overwintering, and then you'll have so many plants in the spring and summer that you can then grow your own. And I believe Marie and the Framingham Garden Club is going to be planting them and then collecting their seeds and then distributing them here for you. Last year we gave away over 2,000 packets of seeds plus bulk. We do a tour. We go around I can't tell you how many winter sow workshops and show people how to do this. And it's spreading. When we first started, we were the only group doing it. And then now you can't find any weekend from like December to, even still going on, that they're not doing winter sow workshops. The difference is most of them are just doing any native seeds. And we will only give out seeds from plants on Dr. Gegear's list, except for columbine and cardinal flower, because I like red. And because, actually Rob's agreed with that because they're a hummingbird favorite as well. So
I agree with everything. And by the way, the plants on my list don't exclude common bees and butterflies. They are visiting them as well, right? So it's not like I'm trying to decrease the number of common things. It's just covering everything, right? So the plants, the common ones like, the imperiled ones don't like, but the common ones will visit and often like the ones the imperiled ones do. So we can cover them all just by shifting our plant selection. And I'd also like to say that my neighbors Peg and Lorraine are sitting here, can come over and collect seeds from my house at any time. You have free reign to just look out for the dog. Maple will jump over. Oh yes. Oh no.
Right across the street.
That's a problem. This could be a problem.
This is just an observation for what was just said. I participated in a winter sowing workshop in Wayland, and it was for natives. Not one of your plants was an offering in that workshop. And that's a problem from what you're saying. And they will serve other purposes, but if your purpose is what you're talking about, then that's not a help. And Wayland, they think they're going to be populating all of Wayland with all these wildflowers, but and they will be, the natives, and they will serve a purpose, as you said, but not the one that you're looking for.
Right. So if it's helping the pollinators or saving the bee, anything with that language, that things might not be what they seem. I'll leave it at that.
If you follow Framingham,
native plants in general, it's great. Sorry.
That's okay. Follow Framingham Garden Club on Facebook, and you will be notified of these kinds of events. And follow the Southborough
Native Plant Gardens of Southborough. It's a Facebook group. And we also post on the town's website, the Open Space Preservation Commission. Not as frequently, but we're on Facebook. It's not for everyone, we know, but we don't have a website yet. Hopefully we'll do that at some point.
So one more question, unless there's anything more really vital.
Hi, I actually have two.
That's
fine. You are talking about nectar sources and pollen sources.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any flowers that are good for both of those at the same time?
So that's an interesting question. So the pollen sources that I have are for active pollen. So there's active and passive pollen collecting. So as bees are collecting nectar, they're going to pick up some pollen in the process. And there are certainly some plants where they don't actively collect, but they passively collect, that are important for that purpose. But you don't see a lot of active pollen collecting on most plants, except for the ones on my list are high quality, and also the bees are actively collecting pollen. So when you look at a bee collecting pollen, it's like it's dancing around on the top of the flower. It's going crazy to kick up the pollen to get it on its body, and then you'll see it pushing it back on its hind legs, or you'll hear it go zzz, zzz, zzz. That's a buzz pollinated plant, like anything that's tomato-like. They're trying to dislodge the pollen, or sometimes you see that running around. So there isn't a nectar plant where everybody's collecting pollen. So I'd say for the most part, they're separate. I treat them as separate things because they're collecting the pollen for a reason. They're all over these particular plants for a reason. It's high quality pollen that they need for reproduction. And so they're in their own category. You could see a bee collecting pollen on something else, but the pollen plants, I think, are the major sources. That's the best way to say it.
Can you just say something about the monarchs and the milkweed?
I can. Actually, I'm glad you brought that up. So if I go back to that list, guess who's not on it? The monarch butterfly. The monarch butterfly has actually increased by 60-something%, right? The monarch is not in trouble. The northern broken dash appears to be in major trouble, right? So planning for monarchs is great, but the problem with the monarch is its overwintering habitat, and maybe with chemical use in the Midwest, but in this area, there's enough milkweed that, the numbers aren't going down. And they really track monarch numbers. So I really trust the increase. What was the year from 2000 to 2019? There was like a 60% increase in monarch populations. So I think if it's certainly okay to put in milkweed for monarch, but if you had space, I would maybe shift to some of the things that needed a bit more. They need to protect overwintering ground, and that's why I think they're trying to get it on the list. But that's in Mexico, not the US, so it's a bit complicated. But the numbers wise, it's increasing. You're welcome.
That's good to know. Okay, well, wasn't that fabulous? So let's give a great thank you, and I'm so glad we could do this.